This lecture will cover socio-emotional development in middle and late childhood. Remember that middle and late childhood is the age group of about 6 to 12. There's a little bit of ambiguity as to when middle and late childhood ends, typically because the ending of middle and late childhood is usually defined as the onset of puberty, which we will be discussing once we reach adolescence. With regard to socio-emotional development in middle childhood, we will be discussing emotional and personality development. Topics included are the self, Erikson's psychosocial crisis of industry versus inferiority, general emotional development, general moral development, and gender development. We will then discuss the role of family, peers, and schools on socio-emotional development in middle childhood. The self contains many aspects. Self-esteem is the global evaluations of oneself. General feelings, positive or negative, about how we feel about ourselves as an individual. Much of this is derived from our self-concept. Self-concept is essentially a bunch of domain-specific evaluations of the self. So when you consider how we evaluate our own academic abilities, athletic abilities, or appearance, all of those are specific domains that are basically make up who we are. And the way that we feel about those evaluations, that in turn is our self-esteem, or influences our self-esteem. Now, as we progress through childhood, we will gain confidence in our ability to master specific tasks and perform in specific situations. Those situations can be social, they can be academic, they can be athletic. All of those different tasks, as we learn confidence or develop confidence in them and basically grow in our confidence and in our ability to master these things, that's our self-efficacy. So we can have self-efficacy in academic situations or athletic situations, and it can be more specific than that. So with regard to academics, children can be confident in their ability to write an essay, or confident in their ability to pass a math test, or confidence in their ability to create a poster board for a science project. All of those are skills and tasks that we're not born knowing how to do. And as we go through middle childhood, we'll start being able to essentially evaluate our own abilities as to how we can perform in these situations. Self-regulation is our ability to manage our behavior, our emotions, and our thoughts. We've been discussing emotional regulation, and we discussed that in early childhood, but this is a skill or a task that develops continuously throughout childhood and even into adulthood. So our ability to manage our behavior, our emotions, and thoughts, this is associated with social competence and achievement. As we gain confidence in our ability to manage our emotions and manage our behaviors and manage our thinking and focus our thoughts how we choose to, that is ultimately going to be associated with increased social skills as well as general achievement, solving problems, and also completing goal-oriented tasks. Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory of personality development describes 8 different crises that the individual experiences throughout the lifespan. Erik Erikson theorized that the major psychosocial crisis of middle childhood is industry versus inferiority. Industry is essentially self-efficacy. It's Erikson's term for self-efficacy or confidence. It's our ability to master tasks and gain achievements throughout middle childhood. And those tasks and achievements can be academic oriented, socially oriented, or even in terms of physical performance. When we begin to compare our own abilities to our peers around us, that can lead to feelings of inferiority, especially if we are consistently underperforming compared to our peers. If we are consistently performing below average in terms of academics and athletics, and we struggle in social situations, all of those experiences can lead to feelings of inferiority. As we begin to see success in those different domains of self-efficacy, or those domains of self-concept, we are more likely to develop a stronger sense of industry. And so Erik Erikson believed that the main goal of middle childhood was to develop a sense of industry, a sense of confidence, a sense of self-efficacy that will help us transition into adolescence. Erikson believed that a major role in this situation is the role of parents, and Erikson believed that unsupportive parents or constant failures can lead to a sense of inferiority, and therefore it's important that parents and teachers support children and help them achieve their goals and remind them of their strengths as opposed to constantly reminding them of their failures and weaknesses. Emotional development in middle childhood is characterized by, one, the ability to suppress or conceal negative emotions. This isn't necessarily a good thing, but it is a skill that we develop throughout middle childhood. In infancy and early childhood, it's very difficult for children to conceal or suppress their negative emotions. If a 2-year-old is angry, they are likely going to express that anger regardless of the situation. Whereas a child that's 8 or 9 years of age is more likely going to be able to suppress those negative emotions or conceal them, and maybe talk about them later or when it's a more appropriate time. They understand that although they may be feeling bad or ashamed or embarrassed or guilty or experiencing any type of negative emotions, it's not always socially acceptable to express them. We also start to see an ability to redirect negative feelings, and so children start to learn the benefits of things like journaling or drawing or talking to people about the way that they feel. And I think one of the major developments that we see in middle childhood is the capacity for genuine empathy, also known as theory of mind from a cognitive standpoint, essentially being able to understand the emotions of other people, and being able to understand when someone is feeling sad or angry or disappointed or embarrassed, having the ability to empathize with that individual and maybe even offer some sort of condolence, as you see in the picture. It's in the middle. Understand that this is a skill, this is an emotional skill that is learned, and therefore it needs to be modeled by parents, as you see on the right. And so when adults model this kind of empathetic behavior towards children, they can in turn essentially imitate that behavior when interacting socially with others who are experiencing negative emotions. With regard to moral development in middle childhood, one of the most prominent theories is Kohlberg's 3 stages of moral development. It was measured using a hypothetical scenario known as Heinz's dilemma. And so the picture on your bottom right shows an illustration of Heinz's dilemma. Heinz's dilemma is essentially a short story or short scenario in which a man named Heinz has a wife who's sick and dying, and although there is a medication out there that can save his wife's life, the medication is too expensive, and the only way that he is able to obtain the medication is by stealing the medication. And so we asked people of all ages, do they think Heinz should steal the medication to save his wife's life? And furthermore, should Heinz be punished for this behavior, and if so, to what extent? And the way that an individual responds to this scenario ultimately determines what stage of moral development they lie in. So young children, they operate at a level of morality that Kohlberg described as pre-conventional. And this is where moral behavior is often driven by punishment and reward. And so children at the ages of 3 or 4, their sense of right and wrong is usually determined by punishment and reward. And so they might answer Heinz's dilemma by saying that Heinz should not steal the drug because stealing is bad. And although there's certainly some truth to that, we as adults understand that, the situation is certainly more complicated. And so it's important to understand that children at the ages of 3 and 4, many times their behavior, their sense of right and wrong, their moral understanding is basically driven by them thinking about, well, if a behavior leads to punishment, then that behavior is wrong and should be avoided. And if a behavior leads to reward, then that behavior should be basically, that's a better choice for a behavior, essentially. So they're constantly trying to basically obtain rewards and also avoid punishment. So if I were to ask someone, why should you not speed down the highway? And their answer was, well, because you'll get a ticket. And ask them, is there any other reason? And they would say, no, the only reason you shouldn't be driving fast down the highway or speeding is because you'll get a ticket. Obviously, that is operating at a pre-conventional level of morality, because their sole determinant as to whether or not the behavior is wrong or immoral is strictly about whether or not they will get punished for the behavior. Now, the conventional level of morality starts to incorporate respect for authority figures. And so This also leads to rules and laws being broken for social approval. So as you can see, when you discuss concepts like authority and social approval, these are social concepts. And so we start to consider the role of other people. And so, for example, the respect for authority figures, sometimes young children, maybe in middle childhood, might follow the rules that are set forth by parents and teachers and police officers and religious figures solely out of respect for that individual. It's not necessarily because there's a punishment associated with the bad behavior. It's really about not wanting to disappoint the authority figure and following the rules out of respect for the authority figure. Now, it's important to understand that rules and laws may be broken for social approval. What does this mean? Well, what you'll start to see in middle childhood is young children oftentimes breaking rules, like basic rules like lying, cheating, or stealing, and many times they do that solely for social approval. So they might cheat on their math homework because they don't want their parents to, they don't want to get a bad grade because they don't want to disappoint their parents, and they might also want to avoid punishment. Or they might, give the answers to their friend on an exam because, they want their friends to like them and they don't want their friends to not think that they're cool. So that's an example of breaking a rule for social approval. You see a lot of teenagers maybe engaging in illegal behavior like graffiti or vandalism or even speeding, strictly for social approval, strictly for impressing other people. Now, if we were to say, why should you not speed, or why should we not speed or break the speed limit? If an individual says, well, it's because it's against the law, and we should just follow the law because the laws are there for a reason. Well, that's going to be an example of conventional morality, because we're really just following the law because that's the law, and we're not really thinking about anything else other than the fact that laws are there and they're put in place by police officers and government, and we should respect that and just follow the law. Post-conventional morality, this is when we start to consider social order. So, for example, we shouldn't speed and we shouldn't break the speed limit because, well, we don't want to hurt anyone. And, we just can't have everyone, driving at whatever speed they want to, because that would be chaotic. We also begin to understand that, some rules and some laws are unfair. Obviously, I don't need to turn this into a history class to think back at, some of the rules and laws that have existed just in our society that have been established to be immoral and therefore have been repealed. Laws against interracial marriage, laws against women voting, laws against African Americans voting. These are all laws that were essentially deemed to be immoral. And so when you think about why people followed these laws, well, some of that, or why they didn't object to these laws, many of that may have been driven by fear of punishment and also out of respect for authority figures. I'm sure one of the reasons many people did not object to those laws was because, well, that's just the law and that's just the way that it is, and too bad, so sad. It takes a much higher level of moral development to object to a law or a rule because you deem it immoral or unfair. So there's a video attached here where you can see different responses to Heinz's dilemma from children of different age groups, and it's really interesting to see how they respond differently to the scenario. Gender stereotypes are broad beliefs about males and females. So as we see, we have pictures here of children that are basically defying gender stereotypes and are engaging in androgynous behavior. Androgyny is the presence of both positive masculine and feminine characteristics. So when we think about gender stereotypes or masculine characteristics and feminine characteristics, typically this is defined by whether or not the majority of the people who engage in the behavior are male or female. So starting with the picture on the left, football. I think we can all agree that football is a sport that is dominated by males. And I'm not saying that is a good thing or a bad thing. It is just an objective observation. And so when we see a female engaging in that behavior, playing football, that is androgynous behavior. That is essentially engaging in a behavior that's more commonly associated with men, and there doesn't really seem to be any sort of negative drawback associated with that. However, you might find people who believe that this behavior is essentially immoral. It's certainly not illegal, but I'm sure we would find people who would say, and maybe older traditionalists who might say, this behavior is not how a girl should be acting. A girl should not be playing with a football. A girl should be playing with a volleyball instead. Now, when you think of volleyball and you think of the gender that's most commonly associated with that sport, I think we can all objectively agree that volleyball is more commonly played by females. And so when a male plays volleyball, that male is engaging in androgynous behavior. They are essentially defying gender stereotypes. Same thing about a boy wearing a pink shirt. The color pink is most commonly associated with females, and so when a boy engages in that behavior, they are essentially defying stereotypes. Think about, if there was a girl who was wearing a button-up shirt, like the way that young man is wearing, along with jeans, and a girl is wearing, a button-up collared shirt with jeans, and she is in a group of other females who are all wearing dresses. Obviously, this individual, this female wearing jeans and a long-sleeve collared button-up shirt, is defying gender stereotypes, and so it's nothing necessarily to be shocked about. It's one of those things to think about, why are people shocked about that? Or why is it that we have these stereotypes to begin with? Long hair. You see this child here in the third picture wearing long hair. Long hair is often associated with the feminine gender role, much like the girl on the left playing football who has long hair. And so if a boy has long hair, is that immoral? Is that something that is either right or wrong? These are just questions that you should think about. How you should, I guess, compare your responses to these types of scenarios to other people's responses, and just try to think about where these attitudes come from. We'll now discuss gender differences with regard to physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional development. We see that female brains do tend to develop a little bit earlier than male brains. The brains of females are slightly smaller but have more surface area. They have more folds in the brain, and we see that boys have higher rates of ADHD and higher rates of diagnosis of ADHD. I just repeated myself there, but why is that? Well, we do believe because their brains are essentially underdeveloped compared to females in middle childhood. Their brains just do not develop as fast as females. And so when we have young males who have a smaller than average brain, than females, or I should say they have less folds than females, and that's not smaller than average. I take that back, because what we're talking about is there's a difference between the mass and the size of the brain and essentially the amount of surface area. And so what we're saying is that boys have less surface area on their brains than girls in middle childhood, and they're also more likely to have higher rates of ADHD. And so we have a correlation here, and we believe from a neurological perspective that there's a direct relationship. With regard to cognitive development, we see that females tend to fare better in linguistics and males tend to do better in visuospatial tasks. Why is that? Is there any sort of biological basis to this, or are these types of skills heavily influenced by the tasks or behaviors that are often associated with these different gender roles? Are there toys that are predominantly associated with visuospatial tasks that are more likely going to be delivered or presented to boys rather than girls? And are there toys or resources that are more focused on linguistics, and are those toys or resources being allocated disproportionately to females rather than males? When we purchase a gift for a child and we consider the child's gender as male or female, understand that all of these gifts or toys or resources, books or trains or action figures, they all have some sort of stimulation to the brain, and they all essentially target different types of cognitive development, whether they be linguistic, visuospatial, or socio-emotional. With regard to socio-emotional development, we do see that boys tend to be more physically aggressive than females. Why that is it learned? Is it biological? I think that by now what we should be open to is the idea that there's probably going to be a biological, cognitive, and socio-emotional influence to all aspects of behavior. With regard to families and how they influence middle childhood, we see that parents tend to spend less time with children compared to the amount of time they were spending with them in early childhood. Why is that? Well, In middle childhood, children become a little bit more independent. They start to learn to be able to clothe themselves and make choices for themselves, maybe even feed themselves. Oftentimes, parents might have a younger child that they need to focus on more so, like in the picture on the top right here. So these children that are 3 years old and 4 years old are often going to require much more attention. And furthermore, in middle childhood, we're spending a lot of our time in school and also engaging in extracurricular activities like athletics. And so we're just going to be spending less time in the house compared to the amount of time that we spent when we were in early childhood. We see that physical forms of punishment actually tend to decline during middle childhood. That might be due towards the fact that children in middle childhood can reason a little bit more than children in early childhood, and so they're able to essentially have conversations about rules and punishments and understand those things and think a little bit more logically. There's also going to be probably more opportunities for negative punishment, essentially removing privileges, removing rewards, and all of those things can be used in lieu of physical punishment. Research states that during middle childhood, parents should, one, support academic achievement. That entails being aware of the child's school performance and managing their behavior associated with school. Monitoring behavior in general, whether that be screen time or exercise time, and also initiate social contact. So what the research shows is that parents in middle childhood should be prompting children with questions like how was their day and what did they learn today and what do they want to do this weekend, because oftentimes children can essentially they aren't going to be the type, they're not often going to initiate social contact. Some may, of course, but by initiating social contact, that'll encourage that type of dialogue that's really important and valuable for authoritative parenting style. And of course, parents should be maintaining a structured and organized family environment. That includes bedtimes, feeding times, chores, expectations, all sorts of things associated with that, with good parenting, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Moving away from family and discussing peers, we were talking about children in middle childhood are going to be spending less time with parents, and one of those reasons is because they're going to be spending more time with their friends. The size of the peer group tends to increase dramatically during middle childhood, and so children are being exposed to lots of social interaction with lots of people directly and indirectly. There's going to be less adult supervision, and there's also going to be a preference for same-sex peer groups. So boys are more likely to want to hang around with boys, and girls are more likely to hang around with girls. And so we see these two groups of children here. There's 7 in each group, and so consider the perspective or the role of a parent of one of these children. How familiar is the parent with the other 6 children in the group? How familiar is the parent with the other parents of the other 6 children in the group? And so when one of these children goes to the house of one of these other children, does the parent know what kind of environment their child is being exposed to when they go over to someone else's house? And so the larger the peer group, basically, the more chances for interaction, the child is going to have. And as we increase chances for interaction, that can essentially expose the child towards positive and negative influences. Bullying is a very serious issue that we have in our society, in many societies. What we see is that boys are most likely to be affected. So boys are more likely to be the victim of bullying than girls. We see that cyberbullying is a rising trend. On the right, you see a graph there that breaks down the differences between how males and females are bullied. We see that males are more likely to be bullied due to their religion or race, although females are not excluded from this. We see that physical appearance and speech are also very common types of bullying. And so when you think about a person who maybe is coming from a different country and practices a different religion and has a different skin tone, and maybe English isn't their first language, or they have some sort of language development issue like a stutter, all of these things are essentially risk factors for being bullied. We see that males are more likely to use physical types of bullying, whereas girls are more likely to use verbal types of bullying. They're more likely to spread rumors. And what we see, and I think this is important to note, is that bullying is oftentimes of sexual nature. And one of the things that we're going to talk about basically is that we're getting into adolescence. And so sexual activity is going to start to be a more common topic in this course because essentially once childhood is typically defined as ending once puberty begins, and puberty by definition is essentially the onset of sexual maturation. And so this really is a big turning point in the lifespan, even though the child is only 9, 10, 11 years of age. Essentially, their life is about to change dramatically, and a lot of that is going to be influenced by sex, just the idea of it. And as you can see here, there's already going to be negative, negative consequences associated with sex with regard to child development. Cyberbullying, like I said, is a rising trend, and with the pandemic striking and all classes, a lot of classes being moved to online, this would be really interesting to know about how those trends have changed, if at all. But we do see that the outcomes of bullying include depression, suicidal ideation, and even attempted suicide. Now, suicidal ideation and attempted suicide are certainly extremely rare in middle childhood, but these cases do exist. And so it's one of those things that, certainly all it really takes is one tragedy, one child to take their life or attempt a suicide or even have suicidal ideations for us as a society to think about, that this situation is pretty serious. So with regard to schools, where bullying often takes place, there's really two major different types of classroom instruction. There is a direct instruction approach and a constructivist approach. And of course, it's a continuum in the sense that people can be solely using direct instruction, or teachers can be solely using direct instruction, or they might have a hybrid or a blend of that and constructivism. So direct instruction is essentially like lecturing, kind of what you're experiencing right now. It's really just about explaining concepts and focusing on content mastery, really preparing students for some sort of exam, like a standardized test. And it's unfortunate that much of our academic performance and much of our success of life is determined by standardized tests. But this approach to teaching really doesn't emphasize creativity. It doesn't promote creativity. It doesn't promote basically students taking the initiative for their own learning. And so a constructivist approach, like for example the discussion section of this course, that is constructivism. Allowing students to express their opinions, tell their version or their perspective, allowing students to become engaged in the role of the classroom. All of that is the constructivist approach. And that research shows that is ideal. It's just not always feasible, and for some courses it's more practical than others. And so it's certainly a skill that a teacher develops over time with experience. And hopefully they understand the importance of changing things up, if you will. Continuing with the discussion of schools, we'll be discussing the role of socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and culture. So what research shows is that minority and low socioeconomic students tend to have more difficulties in schools. So when we talk about African Americans and Hispanics, Latinos who come from a low socioeconomic status background, we're talking about poverty, they are much more likely to struggle in school. They're less likely to graduate from school. They're less likely to become college students themselves. And what we see is that schools in low income areas, they tend to have lower standardized test scores, lower graduation college rates, and younger teachers with less experience. So if you think from a local standpoint and you think of the three major high schools that are in southern Missouri County, you have Brazosport High School in Freeport, and you have Brazos Wood High School in Lake Jackson, you have Angleton High School in Angleton. Now, those three different high schools are in three different areas, and some of those areas are of lower income than others. One of the ways that you can you find out what the income is like for an area is just by typing in median income for Freeport. And so if you type in median income for Freeport, you'll see that the median income is somewhere in the low 30s, somewhere like $33,000. And so what that means is that half the people in Freeport basically make less than $33,000 a year. Now, if you look at the median income of Angleton, you'll see that it's much higher. It's something like $55,000 a year. And so what we're seeing is that half the people in that area make less than $55,000 a year, which is, again, when you compare that to the median income of Freeport. And so what does that entail? Well, you have to understand that schools are funded by property taxes, and obviously property taxes should be related to income. And so what we see is that schools that have higher income from their from the people who live in the city around it, or the area around it, they're going to essentially, in theory, have more access to resources, and so they're going to have more money to invest in technology and academic programs and tutoring programs and that kind of stuff. And so obviously that's going to be associated with standardized test scores as well as graduation and college rates. And so just knowing that Angleton High School and Brazosport High School have this major area in terms of their socioeconomic status, and basically defined by the income around them, you should be able to predict with confidence that Angleton High School is going to have higher standardized test scores on average, as well as higher graduation and college rates. And that is strictly just based on research. It's nothing biased about one town or the other town. The truth of the matter is that I've spent time teaching at both of those high schools, and some of the best students I've ever taught have come from Brazosport High School in Freeport. But again, you have to just understand that it's just a lower income area. They're not going to be able to pay their teachers as much either. And so the teachers' salaries are going to be influenced by this factor as well. And so younger teachers are more likely going to be working in low-income areas, because as teachers gain more experience, they're going to be more desirable for other school districts, and so they're going to have better opportunities to move to a different school district and teach at a different school district that can pay them more. And so what we see is kind of this revolving door of young teachers in these low-income schools. And although it's not always the case, more experienced teachers typically, I think that most people probably rather have a more experienced teacher than a first-year teacher. There are plenty of great first-year teachers, but certainly as someone who's been teaching for several years, I'm quite objectively speaking, I'm a lot better at being at a teacher than I was when I first started. Not by much, but I am. So anyways, it's just like anything. It's really any task that you engage in, you're just going to get better at it over time. One of the things that we're concerned about is that because we can compare school districts, all day long, but we can also look at, international comparisons. We can compare the United States with other countries as well. And what we see is that the United States has a much lower achievement in math and science than several other countries, and that's a major cause for concern. Because we are becoming a more global society in the sense that, private companies are hiring from people all across the world, and, we want to make sure that people from our country certainly are prepared and educated and trained for the global workforce. But it is showing that for whatever reason we're struggling to compete with some other societies. Why is that? Does it have to do with the fact that most of our instruction is geared towards standardized tests? Does it have to do with income and the way that our schools are funded? There's a lot of factors to be considered. And just like with anything having to do with human development, we need to consider lots of different factors. It's very rarely just one thing. So that concludes my lecture on socio-emotional development in middle childhood.